Over the course of the Second World War, Germany produced more tank destroyers than actual tanks, and almost none of them had originally been planned that way. Most of them were reactions. A new enemy tank appeared that German crews suddenly couldn't destroy, so engineers scrambled to find a bigger gun, mount it onto whatever chassis was still available, and rush the result to the front before the situation collapsed completely. What emerged from that process ranged from crude improvised vehicles held together by desperation to some of the most terrifying armored machines ever built. Some were brilliant, some were disasters, and some somehow managed to be both at the same time. But for the men serving inside them, one thing remained constant. Every new solution seemed to create a new way to die. The story really begins during the First World War. Again and again, offensives stalled for the same reason. Infantry could advance through the first trench lines, sometimes even the second, but eventually they outran their own artillery support. Heavy guns dragged by horses simply could not move across landscapes destroyed by shell fire fast enough to keep up with advancing troops. So soldiers repeatedly found themselves trapped in open ground, facing fortified enemy positions without fire support. And they died in enormous numbers because of it. After the war, German officers became obsessed with solving this problem. Infantry needed armored vehicles capable of advancing directly alongside troops while carrying enough firepower to destroy enemy strongpoints immediately. That idea eventually evolved into assault guns. And from there, the entire German tank destroyer program began to grow. At the start of the Second World War, German armored doctrine still seemed logical. The Panzer III would handle enemy tanks with a high-velocity anti-tank gun. The Panzer IV would support infantry using a larger, short-barreled gun, firing high-explosive shells. And then there was the Stug 3. Unlike a normal tank, the Stug had no rotating turret. Instead, its gun sat inside a fixed armored structure called a casemate. That made the vehicle cheaper, lower to the ground, harder to spot, and easier to armor heavily from the front. The trade-off was obvious. If the enemy appeared outside the gun's narrow firing arc, the entire vehicle had to turn. At first, the system seemed to work, but that only lasted until Germany encountered tanks its guns could no longer reliably destroy. The first warning signs appeared during the invasion of France. German anti-tank crews quickly realized their 37mm guns struggled badly against heavily armored Allied tanks. British Matildas and French Char B-1 tanks absorbed hit after hit while continuing to advance almost unaffected. There were reports of German shells literally bouncing off enemy armor. One Char B-1 reportedly survived more than 100 impacts while destroying multiple German vehicles during the same engagement. And suddenly, German crews found themselves facing a terrifying possibility. Their tanks might no longer be strong enough. Germany needed stronger anti-tank weapons immediately. So engineers improvised. Captured Czech anti-tank guns were mounted onto outdated Panzer I chassis, creating the Panzerjäger I, Germany's first true tank destroyer. The result looked crude even by wartime standards. The crew stood exposed behind a thin metal gun shield with barely enough protection to stop rifle fire or shell fragments. From the waist up, they remained completely vulnerable to artillery, machine guns, snipers, and aircraft strafing attacks. But for German anti-tank crews who had spent weeks watching shells bounce harmlessly off enemy armor, even an improvised solution felt better than nothing. For a short time, it worked. Then Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and the entire crisis became far worse. When Operation Barbarossa began in 1941, German forces encountered something they had not fully prepared for: the T-34, and even worse, the KV-1. German crews suddenly faced Soviet tanks whose armor seemed almost immune to standard German anti-tank weapons. Shells ricocheted off sloped armor while Soviet tanks continued advancing through anti-tank fire that should have destroyed them. Some German units described firing repeatedly at Soviet tanks with almost no visible effect. Others watched Soviet armor physically drive over anti-tank guns, while machine guns cut down the crews. The shock was enormous, because Germany suddenly realized the war was evolving faster than its armored doctrine. The response became another wave of improvisation. Captured Soviet guns, larger anti-tank weapons, and obsolete tank chassis were combined into increasingly desperate solutions. Vehicles like the Marders series mounted powerful anti-tank guns onto lightly armored platforms capable of destroying Soviet tanks at long range. The guns worked. The crews suffered. Most Marders were open-topped with thin armor barely thick enough to stop small arms fire. Mortar fragments, artillery near misses, aircraft attacks, or infantry ambushes could tear through the fighting compartment instantly. In urban combat, crews became especially vulnerable. Enemy infantry could attack from rooftops, upper floors, basements, or side streets, while tank destroyer crews struggled to see threats above them. And unlike fully enclosed tanks, many crews had almost nowhere to hide once fighting began at close range. At the same time, another vehicle was quietly becoming one of Germany's deadliest armored weapons, the Stug 3. Originally designed as an infantry support vehicle, the Stug received a longer, high-velocity anti-tank gun capable of destroying Soviet armor far more effectively than earlier German weapons. Suddenly, the Stug became something entirely different. A tank killer. Its low silhouette made it difficult to spot. Its thicker frontal armor improved survivability. And because it lacked a turret, it remained cheaper and easier to produce than many German tanks. On the Eastern Front, Stug crews began destroying huge numbers of Soviet vehicles, often from concealed ambush positions. For a time, it looked like Germany had finally found the perfect answer. But the war kept escalating. And so did the vehicles. By 1943, Germany needed even more powerful guns capable of destroying enemy tanks at extreme range. That led to the development of vehicles armed with the famous 88mm anti-tank guns. Machines like the Nashorn carried devastating firepower capable of destroying almost any Allied tank long before the enemy could return fire effectively. But once again, the crews paid the price. The Nashorn remained tall, lightly armored, and open-topped. At long range, it was deadly. At close range, it became a nightmare. Artillery fragments ripped through the fighting compartment. Aircraft strafed exposed crews. Infantry attacks turned the thin armor into almost useless protection. And yet crews continued fighting inside them because the gun itself was simply too valuable to abandon. Then came the Ferdinand. And the Ferdinand represented the opposite extreme. If earlier tank destroyers lacked armor, the Ferdinand carried almost too much of it. Built on rejected Porsche Tiger chassis, the Ferdinand mounted a devastating 88mm Pak-43 gun inside an enormous armored casemate, protected by massive frontal armor that Allied weapons could barely penetrate from the front. On paper, it looked nearly invincible. In reality, it became one of the most mechanically disastrous armored vehicles Germany ever fielded. The Ferdinand's massive weight destroyed reliability. Engines overheated. Breakdowns became constant. Recovery often proved impossible. Some crews discovered that once their vehicle became stuck, nothing on the battlefield could realistically tow it away. And incredibly, early Ferdinands didn't even include a machine gun for close defense. If enemy infantry reached the vehicle, crews sometimes had to fire pistols through hatches while trapped inside 70 tons of steel. And still the escalation continued. Vehicles grew larger, guns grew heavier, armor became thicker. By late war, German tank destroyers like the Jagdpanther combined tremendous firepower, strong armor, and deadly long-range capability into machines many historians still consider among the most effective tank destroyers of the war. When they worked. That was always the problem, because the Jagdpanther also inherited the mechanical weaknesses of the Panther chassis itself. Final drives failed constantly under stress. fuel shortages became catastrophic. Spare parts grew increasingly rare as Allied bombing devastated German industry. Many Jagd Panthers ended their service not destroyed by enemy fire, but abandoned by their own crews after mechanical failure left them stranded. And for the men inside, that reality became psychologically exhausting. Because surviving combat often meant very little if the vehicle simply broke down afterward. Then Germany pushed the concept even further. The Jagdtiger, one of the heaviest armored fighting vehicles ever built. Armed with an enormous 128mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at extreme range, the Jagdtiger represented the absolute peak of Germany's obsession with bigger guns and heavier armor, and it was almost absurdly impractical. The vehicle weighed over 70 tons. Its gun required separate ammunition loading because the shells themselves had become too large for a single loader to handle efficiently. Mechanical breakdowns became constant. Bridges collapsed beneath its weight. Mud trapped entire vehicles permanently. Even preparing the gun for travel required crewmen to climb outside the vehicle manually. By this stage of the war, Germany often lacked experienced crews entirely. Young replacements with minimal training suddenly found themselves operating gigantic machines that even veteran soldiers struggled to control properly, and many of those crews never had a chance. By the final months of the war, Germany desperately needed something simpler, something cheaper, something it could actually produce in meaningful numbers while factories burned under Allied bombing campaigns. That vehicle became the Hetzer. Small, low, cramped, and relatively cheap, the Hetzer abandoned many of the gigantic ambitions behind Germany's heavier tank destroyers. Instead, it focused on concealment, ambush tactics, and survivability through a low profile rather than overwhelming armor. And surprisingly, it worked. Not because it was the most powerful German tank destroyer, but because it was one of the few Germany could still realistically build while the entire war machine collapsed around it. And in many ways, that brings the story full circle. Because after years of increasingly massive guns, enormous armored monsters, catastrophic breakdowns, and desperate improvisation, Germany ended the war almost exactly where it had started, mounting powerful guns onto whatever chassis remained available, sending exhausted crews into battle inside vehicles built as quickly as possible, and hoping they survived long enough to stop the next wave of enemy armor.